Her husband had been buried in the hard winter ground for 2 years, yet the silence he left behind was heavier than the stones pressed into the earth above him. Fever had taken him quickly, but long before death came he had already abandoned her in every way that mattered. He never saw her heart, never touched her spirit, never cared for the small gifts she tried to offer. Bread still warm from a fire, the comfort of company, the steadiness of a wife who wanted nothing more than to be seen. She had lived beside him like a shadow cast across the wall, faint and unacknowledged. And when the end came, the only thing she inherited was the echo of her own loneliness. The settlements spoke of her kindly, but kindness from a distance is only another way of leaving someone alone. Neighbors said she was strong, said she endured, but no one lingered in her cabin. No one stayed long enough to know her quiet strengths, or the way her hands trembled at night when the wind pressed against the shutters. They pitied her, yet they did not come. So she carried her solitude the way others carried rifles, an extension of herself, a weight she could not set down. On that spring morning, when the light fell through the trees and the soil smelled of thaw and promise, she bent over her stove, coaxing bread from the simple things she still had: flour, water, a pinch of salt. Cooking was her rhythm, the one act that convinced her she still had something to offer. But even as she worked, she heard her own voice from nights before, whispering into the emptiness, "I ain't much, but I can cook." The words tasted like surrender. The door creaked open with no warning. She startled, pen clutched like a shield, until her eyes fell on him, a man framed by daylight, his shape broad, his face worn but steady. He was a stranger, boots dusted from long miles, hat tilted low. Yet something in the set of his shoulders spoke not of intrusion, but of asking. He did not rush inside. He simply stood there, waiting, as though the threshold itself belonged to her, and he would not cross without permission. She found her voice, thin and uncertain. "You need something?" His reply came slow, deep, careful, like words chosen from a place that did not waste them. A meal. A little rest. She wanted to turn him away. Another mouth meant less for herself, another risk in a world already filled with them. But there was something unthreatening in the quiet of him. She nodded, and that was enough to bring him inside. As she cooked, he moved without speaking, setting his gear by the door, glancing at the shelves of herbs, the baskets, the clay pots arranged with more care than value. He saw details others ignored. He noticed her life not as scraps, but as a story stitched together piece by piece. The bread finished. She slid it onto the table. He sat, hands rough from labor, yet he waited until she sat as well before tearing a piece. His eyes met hers, not bold, not demanding, simply present. He tasted the bread, chewed, swallowed, then spoke in a tone almost reverent. "Plain, but it fills a man." No one had ever said such a thing to her. Not her late husband, not the neighbors who pitied her. She felt a laugh slip past her lips, fragile as a bird taking flight. The sound startled her. It had been too long since she'd heard it. The stranger smiled faintly, not wide, but true. He did not press her with questions. Instead, he rose after the meal, fetched water without asking, stacked wood by the hearth. His help came without show, without strings. And she, who had been made to believe she was a burden, watched as her cabin filled with the quiet rhythm of another soul working alongside her. Outside, children's laughter drifted by, 2 orphans racing along the dirt road, their voices carrying a reminder of futures she had never dared picture. A neighbor stopped at the door briefly, offering a nod and a suspicious glance at the cowboy, then left with a whisper of gossip trailing behind. But when the door shut again, the cabin seemed smaller in the best of ways, as if the world had folded to leave just the 2 of them within it. She stirred the pot again, unsure of what to say. It came out before she could stop it, the same weary phrase she had once muttered into the dark. "I ain't much, but I can cook." He looked at her for a long moment, gaze steady, unreadable, before turning back to the fire. Nothing more was said. When the sun finally slid low, painting the walls gold, he broke his silence. "You don't need to do everything alone." Her hands froze at the stove. The words struck deeper than she wanted to admit, because no one, not her late husband, not her neighbors, not even herself, had ever spoken them aloud. She stood still, heart pounding against the silence that followed, as though one door had opened that she was not sure she could step through. And for the first time in years, she wondered if her solitude might not be as permanent as she had believed. The preacher came to her door the next evening, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, eyes hollow from the road. He carried a Bible tied in leather and a cough that rattled his chest like beans in a tin. She let him in without question, setting him by the fire, pouring him broth though it cost her much to share. He ate with trembling hands, blessed the table with a whisper, and left again at dawn, his footprints filling with water as he vanished down the path. The cabin was quiet once more, yet his brief presence lingered, as though the walls had overheard something holy. The cowboy stayed. She hadn't asked him to, and he hadn't declared it, but he lingered like someone who knew storms took more than one day to pass. He fixed the hinge on her door, mended a loose board in the roof, carried in wood as though her burdens had quietly become his own. She watched, wary, remembering how another man once claimed her hand, but never her spirit. Trust was a fire she had learned to keep buried deep, banked low so it wouldn't burn her again. At supper, she sat across from him, the table small, but the space between them wider than the plains. She confessed with halting words that her late husband had not been cruel with fists, only cruel with absence. He had treated her cooking, her care, her love as trifles unworthy of thanks. She said it lightly, but her eyes betrayed the weight of years spent unseen. The cowboy listened without interruption. His silence was not dismissal, but a vessel, holding her story until she finished. Then he said, in that steady voice of his, "You've kept yourself alive. That takes more than most men I've known." Her throat tightened, though she turned away before he could see. No one had ever said survival was a victory. She had carried it like shame, not strength. Night fell, stars sharp as needles against the black sky. She set down a pan of beans and bread, and he bowed his head before eating, not with words, but with a pause of reverence. She felt something stir in her chest, something that frightened her more than loneliness. A knock broke the moment. This time it was not the preacher, but a rancher woman from the settlement, older, with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She stepped inside without waiting, her glance flicking between widow and cowboy. "Whispers will start," she warned, suspicion lacing every syllable. "A widow with a man under her roof, folks will say what they will." The widow stiffened, shame rushing in like cold air. But the cowboy only looked up, calm as river stone, and said, "Let them." His voice carried no apology, no shame, only quiet certainty. The rancher scoffed, muttered something about trouble brewing, and left into the night. Silence stretched long after the door shut. The widow's hands shook as she cleared the table. She heard her own voice again, that old weary refrain that seemed to cling to her like dust. "I ain't much, but I can cook." The words slipped out, bitter with resignation. He rose then, stepping closer, the lamplight carving shadows across his face. She braced herself for pity, for empty comfort, for the dismissal she had known before. Instead, his voice came low, almost a whisper against the crackle of the fire. "You'll never be lonely again." The words struck her like a storm shattering the silence of years. They were not a proposal, not even a promise of love. They were something rarer, a vow of presence. Her knees went weak, and she steadied herself against the edge of the table. For so long she had believed her solitude was permanent, her worth as thin as the bread she made. And yet here stood a man who saw her as whole, not lacking. She turned away, afraid of the hope swelling in her chest, afraid it might betray her if she let it grow. Outside, thunder rumbled across the horizon, a storm rolling in. Inside, another storm gathered, quieter, more dangerous. For if she believed him, if she allowed herself to hope again, she knew her life would never be the same. And as the fire burned low, she wondered if the loneliest truth of all was that she no longer wanted the safety of her silence.